Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Fred Lipschultz, and I am on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to the note in the chat box that audio is disabled for all participants. But if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Eliza Lustig in the chat, who is our technical support person today. Please also note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others as per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide. So I'll kick off the webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Alaska chapter authors. Next slide. So USGCRP, the program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Act of 1990 to, quote, assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of climate change. The program convenes 15 agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide. The same law established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report every 4 years that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends, as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and educators. Next slide. Create the report, the NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors can distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and to important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive and does not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process involves extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Next slide. Now let's take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview, which is followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then there are the national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although response actions are also discussed throughout the report. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, is informed by user input, The NCA5 has added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features: compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. We also have, excuse me, several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. Now that I've gone through some introductory background material, I am pleased to introduce Jeremy Littell, one of the authors of the Alaska chapter, who will lead us through the remainder of the webinar today. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Fred, for that introduction. It was great working with you and others at USGCRP. I want to mention that the bulk of our author team could not join us today. I have several of my co-authors to help me presenting this information for you. But on behalf of the larger author team, I want to thank you all for attending today, and also thank our author leadership team, Henry Huntington, Colleen Strawhacker, and Jeff Falke, who were instrumental in moving the report forward and convening all of the authors to provide the product that you will be introduced to today and can read online at your leisure. Now we don't advance. Okay, so in summary, it's hard to summarize all of the climate impacts and their effects on Alaska and Alaskans in a brief summary, but I'm just going to read this one to you, which is the summary of the entire chapter. Alaska continues to experience rapid, widespread, and extreme climate-related changes. Prompt and effective action can create far-reaching and lasting benefits for today and for future generations. This chapter emphasizes the societal implications of climate change for Alaska, with illustrative examples and recurring themes such as salmon, governance, and adaptation. So one of the challenges in each new National Climate Assessment is describing what's new since prior assessments, and also what is still relevant from prior assessments. So what's new in Alaska for NCA5, there's a much greater emphasis on the societal implications of climate change for Alaska. Prior assessments have touched on this, but have been concerned much more with the physical, ecological impacts, either projected or observed in Alaska, and then their implications for people. In this chapter, we flip that around a little bit and start with the impacts on people and society and trace them back to their climate change origins. It also focuses quite a bit on interacting stressors that are exacerbated by climate change. So not just the climate effects on specific endpoints, but the way that all of the different geographic and cultural dimensions of Alaska interact with climate change to create these tougher problems that we face now and into the future. And then also new is a discussion of many aspects of security affected by climate change, not just, for example, food security, which has previously appeared, but also national security. The Arctic is an important part of North American geography, and the security of our nations depends on how climate change affects the Arctic as well. I also want to point out that the salmon artwork in the background here is reflecting one of the recurring themes in the chapter. Salmon affects many people in Alaska, but in many different ways. These drawings are courtesy of the Chugach Regional Resources Commission and have become a sort of an emblematic symbol of our chapter. So we have 7 key messages that are outlined in the chapter. They focus on several aspects of climate change and its impacts on humans and the environment. Our health and healthcare are at risk. Our communities are navigating compound stressors. Our livelihoods are vulnerable, especially without diversification. Our built environment will become more costly as climate change impacts it directly and indirectly. Our natural environment is transforming rapidly. In other words, climate change is not just something in the future, but affects Alaska now. Our security faces greater threats. Climate change and the intertwined impacts that it has on people and place and politics all affect our security. And our just and prosperous future starts with adaptation. So responding to the impacts of climate change in Alaska in ways that are geographically and culturally relevant is the way that we move forward and respond to climate change. And we have to do that not just as individuals, but in ways that are equitable across the different Alaskas that exist. So I'm going to briefly recap a figure that tries to describe many of the climate-driven extremes and notable events that have occurred since NCA4 or in the recent past. Climate change continues in Alaska. We've gotten questions already that suggest that we've not paid as much attention in the chapter as we have in the past to climate trends and climate projections. And that's true in some ways, but that's because we felt it was much more important to emphasize the impacts on humans. But there have been a number of notable events over the last several years that are directly tied to climate change that have far-reaching effects in Alaska. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One in the 1, 2, 3 area over in the left central part of the diagram that you see here describes the changes in sea ice in the Bering Sea and the southern Chukchi Sea in off of western Alaska. And the historical sea ice extent is that dark blue line in the lower left, and recent retreat of sea ice and maximum sea ice extent in late winter in some years has been much, much less, extremely low compared to historical averages or even the more recent averages that are indicated here. There's also, for example, something you may have heard about in the media called the blob, which was a marine heat wave that had tremendous effects on marine mammals, on salmon, on aquatic life, all through the food web. And you'd require an entire assessment just to trace those effects, for example. We've also seen a number of precipitation and heat events that have been uncharacteristic even by Alaska's highly variable standards. A summer heat wave in 2019 brought unprecedented temperatures to a large fraction of the state. And we've seen record drought in Southeast Alaska that's inconsistent with our expectations for what it means to be, for example, a rainforest. And then followed by an atmospheric river, the kind of event that causes extreme precipitation and is likely to become much more common here in the future, according to future climate projections. But this is just a start. Those climate changes and climate consistent events across the state have had far-reaching impacts on ecological responses as well. Not all of them necessarily detrimental. Some of them are bringing new species to places where they didn't previously exist. For example, salmon are colonizing rivers on the north coast of Alaska where they used to be infrequent or rare and are becoming more common. On the other hand, salmon populations in other parts of the state have been dramatically affected, as we'll hear more about in a few moments. Economically important impacts on fisheries of crab and salmon have been affected very strongly throughout the state. There are also changes in species migrations and distributions that challenge our expectations of what is normal. For example, the Local Environmental Observers Network provides observations of different or odd or notable events all over the state. And it's a great source of information from people all around the state who are paying attention all the time to some of these changes. And from those, we see things like the early arrival of trumpeter swans in Southeast Alaska. We also see major changes in terrestrial ecosystems, including expansion of trees as the temperature becomes more favorable for their survival in the north, but also responses in terms of beetles and other forest pests and insects in Southeast Alaska. So changes ecologically all across the state. The changes in caribou and moose habitats and distributions are also notable in that they affect the subsistence economies in parts of the state that depended on them historically. The climate change responses to each of these kinds of impacts are fantastically complex, in part because it's not just the climate influence on the ecological or physical process, but instead its interaction with societal conditions. So this is just a graphic that describes the impact on Alaska salmon fishing and how that affects different aspects of the entire populace of Alaska. Climate change doesn't occur in isolation in these cases, but in the context of other environmental factors, social conditions, and that limits of our response capacity. If we think in terms of a desired outcome, for example, in this case, good salmon harvests, there's a lot that goes into achieving that goal. So it's not enough, for example, just to focus on the spawning habitat of salmon in their natal streams or in their marine food webs that sustain their survival while in the ocean. Maintaining salmon harvests that meet local subsistence and commercial needs requires attention to all aspects of this problem. So we have warming ocean temperatures that have led to population shifts and declines depending on where you look, and impacts in some places and not in others. We also see that the research investment and monitoring networks and stakeholder needs determine how we think about adaptive capacity for this problem. So what do we do? What do we know? How do we change? How do we potentially make choices to do management differently, for example? The ability of fishers to follow these shifting populations is also constrained by cultural connections, expenses, and regulation. So a lot of the context in which salmon harvest occurs depends on historical climate conditions and historical regulations that were predicated on those assumptions and are no longer necessarily as relevant and certainly not adaptable to the rapid changes that we face now. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alyssa Quintine, to talk about some of the more human dimensions aspects of our chapter. Alyssa?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. So, as we mentioned, this is kind of a newer topic that we explored very deeply. The reason being that the climate crisis affects all of us. It affects people first. That's why we're doing it. And so we want to make sure that we, include the things that we are already experiencing, but what we are doing about it in this chapter. So that was really, really wonderful to see. And one of those key messages is that our healthcare is at risk. We understand that the climate crisis compounds other crises that we've had going on in our communities for unfortunately a very long time, knowing that a lot of our medical staff is already understaffed, underpaid, that a lot of resources that communities don't really get to have in Alaska are further compounded by transportation, by supply and chain demands, all of these different things. And of course, the inequities that we already have in our systems when it comes to race, gender, things of this nature, are further compounded. And one that we really wanted to touch heavily on is that this is not just about our physical health, it's about our mental health as well. Many different communities across Alaska already struggle with not having proper access to mental and behavioral health services. And so we see that further compounding throughout the climate crisis here, especially this year. I know many people can relate. And of course, with a lot of the different crashes that we've seen in our oceans, that also meant that there was less salmon on the table for many communities. There was less opportunities for people to visit their fishing camps and tend their fishing wheels and be able to learn how to hang salmon, how to dry salmon, go crabbing, go shucking for oysters, all of those different things that, are central to our community became less and less, especially, I want to say, I remember certainly here in the interior, people who, would go on the Tanana to, fish, wasn't able to do that this year. So, thinking about how we're working together, not just on a state level, municipal level, but on a community level to respond to these changes is something that we really wanted to both exemplify, with the, record lows and, for some communities, record high. But also, how does that impact us as a community and getting those quotes, getting those beautiful stories into the chapter and go to the next one. So this is part of what we wanted to also bring to the table is a really good understanding of what our communities look like in many different ways, to talk about the inequities of what our communities are facing. And so we did a little bit of research in terms of what are the different demographics that we see in our communities, and how is that changing in relation to what we're experiencing with the climate crisis. And one of that is race, because we know that, because of, racism, because of colorism, because of classism, all these different things, that is going to impact how a community can, for one, interact with their environment around them, but that is also going to greatly impact the resources and the services that they are able to be able to get, especially in times of an emergency. Are they going to be able to, receive emergency care if, historically Black neighborhoods, for example, don't have the best roads because of climate racism? And so, yeah, when the roads are icy and everybody kind of lives downhill, is an ambulance going to be able to get there when we have our next ice storm here in the interior? So that's just an example of how we take, how we take demographics into consideration when it comes to the climate crisis, and how that can both impact us negatively and hopefully positively. The more that we, keep talking about this, the more that we keep doing research, the more that we keep bringing these conversations in. So this is just a little bit of example for folks that may study racial demographics throughout the couple years. We have seen, more increase with Asian, Black, and Latina, communities coming into kind of southeast and southeast, south central, and interior communities. We see those numbers rising. So this, this conversation is going to be, very, very, very important to continue as we're looking at impacts, both good and bad.
Thanks, Alyssa. And as you can see, there's a reason why people often say there are many Alaskas. If you look at these geographic differences in community and population makeup by race, you see that there are different ways and different parts of Alaska in which climate change might affect economies, which is actually the next topic. So if you look, this is just a subset from a figure that includes other sectors in the economy for Alaska, and also subsistence, which for those not from Alaska is a term for how many of our rural communities fill their freezers effectively, the ways that they get food, often culturally appropriate or historical ways. But here we just highlight two of the main economic forces in Alaska: one, oil and gas and development associated with those, and the other, fishing. And you can see it breaks it down by the number of jobs and the dollars in wages associated with those economies, roughly similar in the total magnitude in terms of monetary effect, although very different in the numbers of jobs. But the climate is expected to affect all sectors, these two in particular, in different ways. For example, with oil and gas, further expansion of the efforts may be tempered by efforts to limit greenhouse gas emissions. And we already see this to some degree with funding globally and financing for oil and gas projects, sometimes tenuous at best. Also, permafrost thaw in Alaska negatively affects infrastructure, and we haven't treated permafrost much in this talk, but oil and gas development is a critical part of our economy, and the permafrost thaw affects the ability of those resources to be brought to market in dramatic ways. Fishing, in contrast, the changes in fish distribution will continue to disrupt fishing patterns, arguably more than it already has. We already see strong economic impacts on the fishing economy. We also expect additional fish stocks to collapse in the future because of the strong impacts we've already seen and those that are projected. And so we anticipate very strong effects in different employment sectors and different economic sectors of Alaska. For the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rebecca Pincus, who's going to talk about some of the security implications faced by Alaska.
Sure, thank you. So we added a section on security this year, which is new and is interesting. We talked a lot about how security, which in its broadest sense is, a sense of well-being and safety, right? And security is something that is important at the national level. It's important at the state level to Alaska, and it's also important at the community level. And people at different levels will probably think about or define security differently. But Alaska is very important from a national security perspective. Obviously, the state of Alaska from a state level perspective, security is very important as well. And for community members, for communities and the people who make up those communities, security is tremendously important on a personal level as well. And climate change impacts security at all three levels. And what we're seeing is that demands for security services are increasing at the same time that climate change is placing additional costs for physical infrastructure and operations. And that creates a double burden. And what is interesting, this graph presents climate hazards to DoD sites in Alaska, a selection of DoD sites in Alaska. This is under a pretty high emissions pathway. But what can be seen in this graph is that the climate impacts to DoD infrastructure are the kinds of impacts that are also going to have effects around the state to non-DoD communities and stakeholders. So whether it's river flooding, drought, wildfire, erosion, we're seeing really significant impacts in the future. Again, this is a 2035 to 2064 graph. You can see that there's greater impacts along more coastal areas. The interior locations are a little bit better protected. But there are really, significant climate impacts anticipated. And these are going to intersect with other concerns like changing patterns of maritime traffic, potentially more maritime activity, which would create additional security challenges, changing and difficult to predict ice conditions that might increase the demand for search and rescue activities, the broader geopolitical context of competition with China and Russia means that there's, again, sort of an increasing sense of security challenges in the region. And at the state level, the state of Alaska faces these direct and indirect climate impacts, and we'll also be confronting the economic impacts, potential crime impacts, environmental impacts, and that's going to affect the bottom line of state capacity. Potentially juggling costs about firefighting, infrastructure, maintenance, balancing a budget. At the community level, we can think about food, environmental security, increased danger to hunters and other travelers, small boat operators, sort of the physical risks along with erosion, fires, all of the climate risks that are present. And so we really thought that there's sort of a cascading security impact here that folks in Alaska, whether they're DoD base managers, whether it's statewide officials, whether it's community leaders, they're all going to be confronting this this growing set of security challenges, and it was worthwhile to include it in the chapter this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And that begs the question then, and Rebecca touched on it directly. What do we do? What do we do to confront those changes? Next, I'm going to hand it over to Adelaide Herman, who's going to talk about adaptation and also then move forward into a story specifically about salmon that illustrates some of this. Adelaide?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So I'm doing postdoc work at the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, but I'm originally from the Bristol Bay area, residing in Anchorage, and my job is in Fairbanks. So this process for the NCA5 report was a long, involved process of not only working on the report collectively, but also learning from each other throughout the process by working with teams and finalizing the Alaska chapter together. And with Henry Huntington as our lead author, we worked on the Alaska section. And while Alaska is always different from the rest of the United States, our chapter highlights and describes our concern with climate change well. And I'm really pleased that the report provides a picture of climate adaptation planning in Alaska and the challenges and barriers communities have in adopting and implementing these plans. Rural Alaska communities have been planning for decades, but with the climate adaptation planning, the communities face new threats like was alluded to earlier, potential loss of life, lifestyle, livelihoods, food security, clean air and water, things that we didn't have to always worry about in the past. And so with this figure here, Henry Huntington and Dr. Sarah Trainer with ACAP and Danielle Meeker and I worked on this to try to depict what's going on with rural communities and federal agencies. So as you know, adaptation is going to be essential. There's 229 tribes in Alaska. There's small and large communities, urban and rural. And so we need to consider the barriers to adaptation, including this silo nature of agency responsibilities and limited capacity of many Alaska communities. And then also at the same time, we need to look at successes and share those experiences, and that's happening on several different levels, and find ways to scale up of what is working. Action is urgently needed throughout the state, and the benefits of well thought out actions can be far reaching and durable, leading to a just and prosperous future, one of our key messages. There are communities, tribes, and tribal organizations that have figured out processes to keep their workforce employed by various grants. Not an easy task to acquire the grant management, and if they have managed multiple grants, manage all those grants. I know one small community managing over 50 grants and another regional organization managing more than that. And from my personal observation and working directly and observing and talking with others, it is very challenging and exhausting at the local and tribal level to do this adaptation work. There's a lack of workforce in many communities. Adaptation is a complex process requiring expertise and engagement with multiple entities. And just for like one example here is, if engineers are needed, how does a tribe find that expertise? How does a tribe even find the expertise to write the adaptation plan? Is adaptation a part of the conversation in rural areas? And how many other plans have already been worked on with multiple entities? And so just a little more on this figure here. So climate adaptation requires a wide range of expertise as well as engagement of those who are affected together with other entities, including but not limited to those listed in this figure. And oftentimes local priorities want to be holistic, involving integrated environmental and social issues. And however, on institution on multiple levels are often siloed with specific priorities, which can lead to a duplication of efforts and hamper local efforts. And, it shows that there's these different entities, federal and state agencies, and supposedly they're all supposed to be now working together to provide services to rural Alaska, but that's really not happening as well as it could be. There's executive orders, there's toolkits, guides to help tribes and local communities step up to the plate and work on these plans and work with the federal agencies to get all these opportunities. But it's really exhausting to go in and look at all of these opportunities, try to figure out, how to get these grants, how to manage the grants, and how to manage multiple grants over time. And as I said, there's been some tools developed as well as some educational efforts. There's the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network through Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center and peer-to-peer learning and knowledge exchange in the community-led relocation, managed retreat, and protected place. And then I'll just briefly talk about the loss of salmon. The region I come from is the red salmon capital of the world, and our fishery is not declining, but then there's other region, other parts of the Bristol Bay region, like the Chignik area, that has lost their salmon. And we wanted to do this by telling stories, because those have the most meaning to and most impact, I think, on explaining how the loss of salmon has affected people. So this one lady that participated in the Chignik fishery for all her life, she mentioned that she lives in Kodiak, and she went back to Chignik, and so there wasn't a salmon fishery. So I think the Kodiak area provided the Chignik area with salmon, probably frozen fillets. And she said it's just not the same. For 80 some years she participated in the fishery, and preparing the salmon in many different ways, and passing that cultural way of life on to the next generation. And same goes for the Yukon-Kuskokwim area. Salmon is their way of life, and to take that out of the culture equation is absolutely devastating to that people. And then the people having to deal with federal, state regulations, and trying to combat that with their salmon commissions and things like that is not an easy task. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, Adelheid. And now you can see from these stories why it takes so much to unpack each of the impacts and each of the adaptation stories that come from them. We've been asked a number of times, well, why isn't there more in here on climate trends and climate projections? And you can find a few sentences on that in the chapter where it's needed. But really, it's these stories that illustrate the impacts of climate change on people in Alaska and how complicated they really are. And then also what the adaptation for our just and prosperous future looks like. And you can see that it takes everybody in the state, because it's affecting everybody in some way or another. So with that, I want to thank our presentation team, but also our chapter author team, including the chapter lead, Henry Huntington, for seeing us through this effort, and his leadership was amazing. And then also the agency chapter lead authors and contributing authors that helped make the chapter what it is. And I hope that you'll find time to go look at it. It's even richer than we've been able to highlight in our short time with you here today. And then if you need to go find the chapter specifically, it's here. There's lots of extra graphics and things like that. And of course, all the text if you want to read it. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Fred, our facilitator.
Thanks,
Thank
Jeremy.
you all.
And thanks everyone who gave the presentation, and certainly